This webinar entitled Cyber Warfare, the Reality is we are all under attack. This presentation and its content is copyright of JANUS Associates, and all rights are reserved. Any redistribution or reproduction of the contents in any form is prohibited unless you have received written permission from JANUS Associates. My name is Lyle Lieberman, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at JANUS. I'll be your moderator for today's presentation. Online with me is Matthew Lane.
Good morning.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Or maybe morning.
Depending where you are.
JANUS's Vice President and Chief Information Officer, who will be giving the actual presentation. On behalf of everyone at JANUS, I would like to thank you for taking the time to attend today's presentation. So why don't we get started? I'd like to take a quick 2 minutes and share a little bit about JANUS. Data security has always been paramount for those in the financial community. And large financial institutions have huge and sometimes unlimited budgets to throw at problems as they crop up. But the quandary that ICBA members face is how to best protect your assets, both data and financial, without having the financial resources that the mega banks have. And we hope to help you address some of those issues today. We at JANUS understand those challenges. JANUS is an independently owned small business with world-class experience in the financial sector. We specialize in all aspects of cyber and information technology security services, and we are a vendor-agnostic firm, meaning we sell no hardware or software. And that means that we never look for or create problems in an effort to sell you additional products or services. That's one of the reasons why our clients trust us. JANUS has offices in a number of locations, and we are but a phone call away. One advantage that we offer our clients is our proximity to 4 major airports, which allows us to secure cost-effective flights whenever we go on client site. As I previously mentioned, our services include GRC, which is Governance, Risk Management, and Compliance Solutions. We also offer application and data security testing, infrastructure, architecture, and system review, computer-based employee security awareness training, and security and compliance assessments. The logos within the white box at the bottom of the screen represent some of our financial clients, both U.S.-based and international. Over the years, we have been contracted by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, the FDIC, and all of the Federal Reserve banks nationwide to perform a variety of IT security-related tasks. We were also engaged by the Treasury of the Republic of Georgia to develop and write an end-to-end IT security policy for their entire operation. We think all of this speaks to the thoroughness and quality of our work. Even with high-profile clients like this, we would like you to know that our services are affordable. Unlike large firms with high corporate overhead, JANUS is a small and highly nimble firm without layers of bureaucracy and the inherent cost of supporting a bloated infrastructure. Lastly, JANUS never practices the gotcha principle. And by that I mean that we always work in a collaborative manner, and our reports are written in plain English without excessive technical ease. Should you choose to engage us, you will always have access to senior management should any questions arise. I'd like to turn the presentation over to Matt now, and he'll take over from here.
Thank you, Lyle. I'd like everybody online to quickly read through some of these quotes. Just take a minute and read through these. I think they're pretty sobering. As experts in information security, let me make one fact very clear. Cyber attacks and cyber warfare has already occurred and will continue to do so. I've been giving a presentation like this for over a year and a half, 2 years now. And I think 2 years ago, the topic of cybersecurity was something very, very new. A lot of people, cyber warfare was very, very new. A lot of people felt it might not happen. I think today that's very different. Today we know that the Secretary of Defense believes China was involved in cyber espionage and electronic warfare. That announcement, along with the announcement a few months ago that China was actively hacking American computer systems, underscores the importance of the discussion that we're having today. So let me share a few additional examples of what we've seen that support that last statement. We recently engaged with a major electric utility to perform a security risk assessment and penetration test of their systems. The systems included SCADA remote infrastructure access and control networks. SCADA networks, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is the large control network for power plants and water distribution systems, for example. Using readily available tools and procedures, our engineers broke in and took over their systems within 24 hours. Had we been cyber warriors and knew their generation and distribution infrastructure from early reconnaissance, we could have easily shut down portions or possibly their entire grid. It's also possible that we could have damaged their generation equipment by activating relays, shutting down safeties, over or under revving turbines, and of course that could cause catastrophic damage. In another recent engagement, this time involving a financial entity, we discovered web-based application source code that had never been properly tested for security issues. This software had been in use for years, and the flaws that existed resulted in an unknown entity gaining access and actually owning the computer systems completely undetected for a long period of time. My final example is a smart grid project that we have been involved with. Smart grid projects in this case are sort of the Internet of everything. This is where your washing machine and your dryer and your oven are all on your home network, and they talk back to the vendor, and they talk back to the electric provider in your neighborhood. In this case, we discovered that a client had a website that was accessible and unauthenticated. No passwords or user IDs were required. This site contained proprietary operating system code and tools to toggle equipment functions on and off. Our analysis of their log files yielded the following facts. The log files were set to keep only about a month's worth of activity, and those records indicated that the system had been subject to frequent scans from China and other countries. Did anyone actually gain access, look around, or download data? To be honest, we don't know. They didn't have the telemetry to answer that question, but there's a very good chance that all of this activity occurred. So why am I sharing these quotes on the screen? Because all of this is food for thought. Some circles have hoisted the flag and they say it's coming. There are very, very few that say don't worry anymore. It's not a big deal. I think today we realize it is, and that's been a great shift. But based in our experience, we say that attacks are already happening. How catastrophic they'll become in the future really just remains to be seen. So I hope the most important takeaway from this presentation for you that you need to be aware and you need to take precautions now to protect your organization's best interest in the future. But why do we care? Do we really care about protecting our name? As it turns out, as you'll see here, 55% of adults say that they would change banks if their bank incurred a major hack. 46% of adults would switch insurance companies. 42% would go to a different drugstore or pharmacy. Later we'll talk about how major hacks have affected some of the more recent retail outlets that have been compromised recently. But this is really the reason why we protect our data. The name brand of our organization cannot be insured against. If our name brand is compromised, then unfortunately we have a lot of work to do and there's no easy way out of it. But of course, the purpose of today's webinar is cyber war. It's all to help you understand what cyber war is. Before I get started, I'd like to take a moment and frame today's presentation. Looking at the list of people who were invited to this, it turns out that many of you are in IT, many of you are in finance, but how many of you actually have a background in military attack planning? Probably not many, probably a very small percentage. But I'd like you all to start thinking like a military attack strategist, because those are the people who are attacking you. We've got to frame this conversation in terms of a military-style attack against your organization. And in order to do that, I need to describe who the players are in the environment, what the threats are in the environment. The first term we'll talk about, I'm sure everyone's heard this term, is hacker. Hacker goes back to the 1960s, where it was originally used to describe individuals who would make innovative, quick changes to electronic equipment. It evolved to include individuals who make quick and innovative changes to software. And additionally, it would describe users who circumvented telephone systems. And today, of course, its most common use is to describe someone who circumvents computer security controls. It's a general term. What it doesn't describe is the motivation behind the hacker. And for that, we need other definitions. Hacktivist. Hacktivism is generally considered to occur when the hacker is looking to promote a social or political agenda. We generally see hacktivism in the form of website defacement, denial of service attacks, site parodies, and typo squatting. Typo squatting is where someone finds a website that looks very similar to your website and then buys that website name.
Right. An example might be if your organization is called, I don't know, the First Bank, and your website is firstbank.com. They might purchase the website name firstbank.biz or firstbank.net. When your customers log on, all they generally look at is, am I on First Bank? They don't look at the extension, so they don't look at the .com, the .biz, the .net. And that's where typo squatters get away with this sort of activity often.
Yes, thank you, Lyle. Now, some of you, let's see. So the key here is that there is their intent, the hacktivist's intent, is really just to make a point. The hacktivist wants to do what they consider to be the right thing. They want to do good for their cause. That is their motivation. And we're going to talk a lot about motivation behind hackers today, various types of hackers, because that's going to help us build the right set of defenses. I should also note that hacktivists are not necessarily state-sponsored entities. They're generally independent individuals or organizations. The next player in the game is the cyber terrorist, a close cousin to the hacktivist. Like the hacktivists, they are politically or socially motivated. However, they are not beyond causing real damage or injuries. This type of activity includes cases where air traffic control gets disrupted, 911 systems are disabled, waste management systems are forced to malfunction. Cyber terrorists may act alone or in groups, and they may be linked to a political organization or in some cases even sponsored by a country. So they will do real damage. They're sort of like the hired militia in a lot of ways. Now, another term we hear a lot of is cybercrime. What is cybercrime? Who are these cyber criminals? Well, cyber criminals are hackers who certainly are breaking the law. But in the case, in general, we see their motivation as being financial. They are often part of an organized crime syndicate. They can be associated with a country or geographic region. Cybercrime ranges from theft of credit card information, personally identifiable information, competitive data, and intellectual property. In other words, pretty much anything they can use for their own personal gain to sell to someone else. To the cyber criminal, it's all about the money. These are the criminals who are seeking to commit fraud and steal money from the bank. And then finally, we move on to the concept of the cyber warrior. This type of hacker generally is sponsored by a country or is part of their organized military. The picture on your screen is that of the China Blue Army, which is a state-sponsored cyber warrior unit comprised of highly trained hackers. They perform all of the regular warlike activities, including espionage, reconnaissance, arms proliferation, carrying out attacks, and defending their own environment. We'll talk about these ideas in a little bit. In the case of the cyber warrior, their activities are controlled by a larger command structure and may be integrated into larger traditional war activities and political maneuvering. So in short, the cyber warrior is part of the larger command structure. They are the boots on the ground in the actual cybersphere. But I want to take a minute and really clarify that these definitions are fairly simplified. It's possible that a hacker can be 20% hacktivist, 40% cyber criminal, 10% cyber warrior, 30% cyber terrorist. Any individual or group can be motivated by multiple goals. But for the purpose of this webinar, the cyber criminal wants to steal money from the bank. The cyber warrior wants to break the bank and cripple the economy.
Matt, before we continue, the one thing that I failed to mention at the very beginning is there's going to be at the end of this presentation a question and answer session. So if any of you have questions at any point during the presentation, please enter them into the box on your screen and we'll be happy to address them.
Thanks, Bob. So now we know who the sort of general actors are in the cyber war area, who the hackers are, and we have a couple of definitions for what their motivations are. The motivations are going to help us out as we start to build our defenses up. But of course, we now know who's in the war. Now we have to ask, what is war? Since today's topic is cyber war, I want to make sure we have a good definition of traditional war. So let me read the definition that is straight off the Wikipedia page. It is a political mechanism to force another group of people to change and act differently. It is an organized, prolonged military conflict between sovereign entities. It affects violence, aggression, and mortality. There's a few academic variants of that, such as Cold War, but of course we're here to discuss cyber war. So if we're going to talk about cyber war, it should be a computer and network-based version of this definition. Can network-based computer attacks force people to change and act differently? Well, sure. We saw on one of the earlier slides that over 50% of people would actually change their bank if their bank had been compromised. What happens when an attack brings down an electrical grid, communications, or vital service such as 911? What happens when the water supply is affected by a cyber attack? If any of this happens, the cyber warrior has succeeded in that task. Can cyber attacks be organized, prolonged, and military-based? Yes. It is alleged that the U.S. and Israeli governments wrote Stuxnet, which is a piece of malware specifically designed to shut down uranium enrichment facilities. Assuming this was the case, it would be one of the first known cyber attacks focused on crippling a sovereign nation's nuclear arms program. Likewise, it is widely reported that Russia, in the days preceding the ground invasion of the Republic of Georgia, used a denial-of-service attack to shut down Georgian websites. This was the first step in a prolonged cyber attack, and eventually the tanks did roll in. I urge you all to Google the term "From Georgia with Love." You will find a description of targeted malware specifically designed to steal documents from people who are in the country of Georgia, record their conversations, run commands on their machines, and then ship them back to Russia. It sort of looks like the alpha version of the flame virus. And it was the second step in a prolonged cyber war launched against the nation of Georgia. So wars, whether traditional, cold, cyber, whatever, affect violence, aggression, and mortality. However, when we think about cyber attacks, we don't generally think in terms of large-scale violence. One could speculate that, given the right circumstances, that cyber warriors could shut down a power grid, which could lead to loss of life. When a hacker directs a waste treatment facility to discharge contaminated water into the environment, it can cause illness. And we could speculate that if a cyber warrior gained control over the network, which controls the U.S. drones, it would certainly be possible for that warrior to affect mortality. It's important to remember, though, that wars are not waged with tanks alone, nor are they waged with guns alone or planes. They are waged with a combination of tools and technologies. The cyber weapons we see today are just part of the overall battle sphere. So what do cyber warriors do, and what are they potentially after? Well, the answer is pretty much everything. They're looking to gain control of systems, critical information, infrastructure, and anything they can use that will give their leaders a tactical edge and disrupt the normal way of life. I guess the next question is, how is it that they do this? And we'll take a moment here to quickly study what's been going on. I'm sure everyone has heard that Target had lost a large amount of credit card data recently. We could just take a few minutes to kind of go over what we do know. We do know that there was a piece of malware called Black POS, or Black Point of Sale, that is well known and well used out in the cyber terrorist and cyber criminal communities. It was available out there for sale. This was probably part of the attack. We know that there were some passwords that had been compromised, some hard-coded passwords, and I believe even just today we found out that one of the passwords that was used was actually not from Target employees, but from one of Target's heating and air conditioning providers, if I recall. Lyle, did you heard about that as well?
Matt, I actually received a briefing on this earlier today. It seems that Target stores have advanced environmental system controls, HVAC systems, lighting, the whole 9 yards. And all of this is remotely monitored and remotely accessible by their contractor. This allows the contractor to know if something is malfunctioning, if there were substantial temperature variations, or if lights are being turned on in the middle of the night unexpectedly, meaning the whole store is being illuminated. It also gives the contractor the ability to upgrade the software that controls the systems. From what federal authorities have been able to find out thus far, it appears that the contractor's website was attacked, and as a result of that, the attackers were able to then get into the contractor's internal systems via stolen passwords. They found additional passwords then for the Target systems, and they used that information to leapfrog into the systems at Target. Now, what they got into initially was, again, the environmental systems. But for whatever reason, it seems that Target didn't separate and segregate the systems, the HVAC systems, the environmental systems, from the rest of their network. This mistake allowed the attackers to move laterally throughout the Target network to the point where they were able to attack the point-of-sale system, load some malware, load the malware on a number of terminals for a 2-day period just to make sure it was working properly, and then loose it chain-wide. And the result is history.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one example. We see other examples in the news today. South Korea just had 40% of their citizenry breached because of an insider threat. Someone who worked at the Bureau of Credit Affairs walked off with 40% of the PII of the country. That's huge, and these things are happening all over the place. We should probably move on to the phases of cyber war, because we could certainly talk about the examples all day, but in a lot of ways they all sort of follow the same path, and I think that's what I'm speculating everyone on the phone wants to learn. What is that path? What's the basic layout? What do they do in order to break into systems? So let's talk about the components of war. If we're at war, we need to have an understanding of what the warlike activities are. Actors in the cyber war have the same goals as traditional warriors, and these goals are reconnaissance, espionage, arms proliferation, aggression, and defending their own environment. So let's talk about how these basic components are implemented in the cyber war and what the attack vectors are of the cyber warriors, so maybe you can be sort of better informed to look out for what's going if something like this is going on. The first major activity is reconnaissance. And that is the act of observing the activity of the potential target. This includes obtaining public information and compiling it into what's called a profile. Some of you may know that the term social engineering exists, and that may be part of reconnaissance. But how will reconnaissance look to you, and what should you look for? It may take the form of cold calls to your phone system. It may start out as robocalls and escalate to calls which seem like telemarketers. They may try and garner information about your operations and infrastructure. They may try and steamroll through your accounting group, acting as a collection agency, a client, or even a business partner. They may call your help desk and act like a confused user. But what they're looking for is any information which can give them insight into how your operation works, technically and procedurally. So those cold calls that offer you a $50 bonus for answering a few technical questions about your network, that's probably reconnaissance. The salesman that knocks at your door and asks you if you need cheaper paper or copier paper or office supplies, that could be reconnaissance. The technician that shows up to service your servers, your fax machine, or even your water cooler, that could be reconnaissance. The occasional port scan of your network that seems like no big deal, that's definitely reconnaissance. The question is, are they all malicious? Well, they could be. Not every call, salesman, or port scan is intended to observe your environment for a later attack. In some cases, they're, well, fairly legitimate. But it's up to you to be observant and know the difference between friend and foe, so you can always keep your guard up. And how to do that. With respect to reconnaissance, the best first line of defense is asking the question, does this make sense? Are you expecting a visit from the hardware vendor? Have you checked his credentials? Is the water cooler repairman spending time in places where there isn't a water cooler? It may be impossible to completely stop reconnaissance. However, a well-trained employee can spot suspicious activity. Cannot stress the importance of a well-formed security training and awareness program. I would say that's probably one of the most important things that you can have. I will talk about training a little bit later, but the best way to stop and spot reconnaissance is by training your employees and to spot it, and also testing their skills and doing so at a regular basis. The second component of cyber war is espionage, in other words, spying. The goal of spying is to obtain information about your organization, which is normally kept secret. This information may help the would-be attacker form a more specific attack. Espionage usually involves reconnaissance. However, it takes it a step further in that it has very specific attack vectors. This may appear in the form of an attempt to compromise your help desk. It may appear as Trojan malware that's pushed to all your employees by email. It may involve socially engineering the human resources group by hiring a new employee who really works for the enemy, or convincing you to open up a PDF that contains a keystroke logger. But what are cyber spies looking for? Well, it's important to remember that traditional spies are by nature fairly good at concealing their activities, and cyber spies are no different. They're pros at being invisible, and they're looking for your intellectual capital, confidential information about your organization, and basically anything you don't want them to have access to, anything that's not public. So now we move on to arms proliferation. In a conventional war, for example, it precedes the war. In some cases, it takes place at the onset of war. And in the case of the Cold War, it was the reason for the war and, of course, the deterrent at the same time. In the case of cyber war, arms proliferation takes place in the form of malware, keystroke loggers, rootkits, toolkits like Backtrack and Kali, which contain a variety of tools. Other tools include the Black POS system that we described before. All of these tools are available on the internet if you know where to look for them. Some are free, some aren't, some are fakes. Now, the point here is that the tools are evolving and changing every single day. There are online resources that will help anyone write their own malware and test it against 40 different malware detection systems. And this information is free to anyone else who knows where to find it. What's different about arms proliferation in the cyber sphere, though, is that the arms and tactics change on a daily basis. In a traditional war, arms proliferation would take months, weeks, years sometimes to come to fruition. So how does the arms race affect you? It's similar to the arms race. Now, of course, the arms race in the new world, if you had a DMZ in the old days, or maybe an application firewall, your systems were not the sort of low-hanging fruit that a hacker would go after. Today, you need an advanced intrusion detection system on your internal network so that when malware does get in, and sooner or later it will, you can detect its activity and locate it quickly. So now let's move on to the real meat and potatoes, the attack. Up to and until now, we discussed espionage, reconnaissance, and arms proliferation. Certainly bad things are happening to the target during these phases, and data may have been lost, compromised, or corrupted. But what makes any war, including a cyber war, is an aggressive attack. What forms of aggression are there in the cybersphere? I've already mentioned the Russian military shutting down the Republic of Georgia's server prior to a ground attack. Another example are the keystroke loggers that were discovered on the workstations which controlled U.S. drones in the Middle East. These keystroke loggers were discovered just prior to the loss of the drone over Iran, and of course the subsequent recovery and public display of that drone by the government. I think it's readily apparent and safe to assume that we're moving into a new era of warfare, cyber warfare. But how will it affect you? Well, you've taken the first step today by attending this webinar and becoming more aware. We're all here because we are concerned about the future security and well-being of our respective organizations. How will the attack look to you? Of course, if I had that answer, I would go do something to stop it. But here are a few things you can kind of look out for. Non-standard data destinations. Most malware wants to send information to the command and control system, the system that controls the malware, that pulls the data off your computers. Once malware is identified, the command and control systems are either shut down or their IP addresses show up on shun lists, so your firewall can block them. But the really truly nefarious malware has not been analyzed, categorized, or dissected. And as such, there's no signatures in the malware industry. Ultimately, we would like to detect really odd network traffic, but of course, this is as challenging as ever with the tangled mesh of advertising resident on today's websites. Additionally, newer malware tends to have command and control systems that move around the globe dynamically. So you can't just find one IP address and then block it. Another thing that we can look for is sluggish systems. Certainly back in the old days, our system would slow down. We'd go, oh, I got a bug, and we'd run some scans, and hopefully we'd get rid of the bug. But of course, systems slow down for a variety of reasons, and systems that are constantly generating network traffic could have been compromised. Unfortunately, today's malware is really quite efficient, so systems don't bog down the way they used to. Sluggishness can also be caused by electromagnetic interference. Additionally, a lot of the malware that's out there today will be so kind as to patch your system and actually make it faster by shutting down your antivirus. So actually, when your machine gets faster, that's when it probably got compromised. Finally, diversions. Remember that you may be under attack, and the attackers may be diverting your users by some nefarious method. These include everything from a denial of service attack, deploying the fire alarm in your building to force people away from their computers. Additionally, some attackers will execute a distributed denial of service attack just to cover their tracks as they're stealing your corporate information. However the attack takes place, the big question is, how do we defend against it? Let's take a moment to look at a few facts. We see that 44% of attacks last year were due to hacktivism, 47 were due to cyber crime, so those are roughly the same. And the rest were cyber war and cyber espionage. On this graphic, they've broken out cyber espionage, from war. And in this case, that means stealing corporate secrets versus just stealing money or stealing something that can be turned into money. The key here is that cyber war has really increased in the last 2 years. Even though it's a small piece of this pie, it's still a fairly large piece of the pie. And what's going on in that small percentage is really, really quite bad, and very different from the cyber warfare, the cyber crime techniques that we've seen in the past. This graphic is the distribution of targets. So 14% is finance, that's a large piece. Government is 23%, still large, but industry, which is 22%, 22% for industry. And then there's that 20% other over there. I wonder what that is. It turns out that a lot of organizations don't have the ability to track an attack. So they know that information has gone missing, but they just don't know how it went away. I think that other probably is what that is all about.
Matt, I'd also like to add in that the industry figures should be of interest to our audience on the phone today. Industry at 22%, so that would be your customers, and their systems are being attacked in order for the attackers to gain access to their banking credentials. So in reality, the portion of the top targets that directly affects financial institutions, specifically banks, is really not 14%, but it's actually a whopping 36%.
Thank you. Now, this slide is the techniques that are being used to perpetrate the attacks. We see distributed denial of service attack at 23%. That's up greatly this year. But if we look at it on a month-to-month basis, we'll see that in some months, the DOS attacks are 80% of the tools that are being used. Other months, they're 2%. It's very bursty. The same thing with SQL injection. It swings widely depending on what problems are reported that month, which bugs are found. And here we have the unknown group again. I think that's the same areas we were talking about before. Unknown. What's an unknown attack type? We know money went missing. We don't know how it went away. The individual covered their tracks, so we'll never know. So let me take just a quick minute and tell you a brief story. A lot of what I'm talking about now sounds like something that you need James Bond to do, or a secret agent of some sort. I guarantee you that it's really so easy that a 6-year-old can do it. My child's teacher recently pulled me aside and said that my son had been stealing jewels at school. Of course, I asked, who brought jewels to school and why would he steal them? Turns out they were in an online game. They have a learning game where you walk around and solve math problems and solve English problems, and when you solve them correctly, you get jewels. At the end of the week, the group with the most jewels can buy something at the school store. My 6-year-old saw someone in another class log in, saw their password, saw their credentials, logged in as that individual, and then gifted the jewels in the game over to himself. I did not teach him this, by the way, but it did put me in a very interesting situation, because I'm now in a situation where I have to respond to computer fraud that has been committed by a 6-year-old. So that brings me to the question of how do you respond to a cyber attack? Like disaster recovery, risk assessments, and business continuity, a cyber incident response plan is the one item that you really have to have if you're going to survive the storm. This plan identifies who you will notify in the event of an attack and how you will respond. Also, how you will continue operating during the attack. And finally, it identifies who you will identify in an attack. But basically, it needs to be figured out now, not at the time of the incident. It's too late at that point. You need a cyber attack response plan that's properly written, updated, and tested on a regular basis. If you're hearing this and thinking, I already have a DR plan and an incident response plan, well, that's very good. However, it's important to realize that responding to a cyber war event is not the same as responding to a cyber crime event. Cybercrime often appears to be fraud and theft. Banks and insurance companies are used to dealing with fraud and theft, unfortunately. But remember, a cyber criminal may seek to steal your intellectual capital so they can sell it to your competitors for profit. A cyber warrior wants to steal your intellectual capital so they can damage the economy. Since the motivation is different between the criminal and the warrior, the targets are going to be different. As such, the attack vectors will be different, and as a result, the response to the attack needs to be appropriate to the attack. This means that the types of logs required for analysis will vary with the attack. I should also note that cyber criminals want to go in, get data, and bring it out of the network so that they can sell it. Cyber warriors sometimes just sit and wait and listen without taking a lot of data. Our internal intrusion detection systems, data leakage products, they won't necessarily pick that up if they're not tuned to do that. Who you will notify, however, depends on your industry and the type of attack you experience. In some cases of theft or fraud, you may be able to handle it internally, or at least with business partners such as insurance agencies. In the case of cyber war, you may need to notify local, state, or federal entities, and you may need to work closely with your ISP in the event of a distributed denial of service attack. The key point is, with respect to a response, is that you have to have a list of current contacts in your response plan. It's also important to remember that reacting to a cyber war event will probably include navigating some uncharted waters. There isn't a tool or an appliance that will protect you. The cyber warrior is, by nature, evading all of the commercial off-the-shelf products and standard defenses. So be prepared to work with your industry peers as well as law enforcement. That's very different from possibly a small event of fraud. So how do we tell if our safeguards are effective? Well, the one sure way to do it is to simulate a cyber attack. And to do so, you need to hire people who think like cyber warriors but are not malicious. This may take the form of internal security testing for your environment, and this can generally be achieved by internal engineers or with the assistance of an external security party. But the external third-party testing is very important. Have a regular independent third-party review of your environment done at least yearly. Regularly testing your plans and environment by a recognized industry leader can help you prepare for a potential breach by a cyber warrior, cyber criminal, or fraudster. The third-party assessment needs to be comprehensive and needs to look at all systems. Often we see auditors accept areas where they have only done a penetration test of a third of the network each year. The cyber warrior doesn't look at a third of the network. The cyber warrior looks at the whole network. So it's important to test the whole network. Now, the advantage to third-party testing is that your internal security tests focus on detecting and defeating known attacks. Third-party specialists brings current industry knowledge to test against the latest and newest threats. Interestingly, testing your system's defense mechanism is actually less expensive than responding to a breach. I've heard some people refer to security testing as an insurance program. Although I don't necessarily agree with that analogy, it can cost 8 times more to remediate after a breach versus having had secured the infrastructure initially. This cost is Also, only the loss associated with PHI, PII, and credit card data. In a cyber espionage event, the loss of intellectual property can shift the cost benefit of new product development from profit to loss and can actually derail the whole business process. Now, unfortunately, cyber events do happen. So it's important to test your response plan. Testing any incident response plan can be complicated and time-consuming, but it needs to be done. Once a cyber attack is detected, every minute counts. Figuring out what to do then can cost huge amounts of time. So we developed a cyber incident response plan, which should be an extension of our traditional response plan. The plan should list the role and position of each function in the plan. Employee names should not be used, as that specific employee may not be available at the time of the incident. The plan should clearly assign communication tasks, specifically under which circumstances and between which entities the information is to be conveyed. The incident plan should answer the question, who's in charge when things go wrong? What authority do they have? What personnel resources are available? And how long and where will the investigation boards be created? The incident response plan should reference a regular training and awareness session. It's important that organizations provide appropriate incident response training at least annually. And like a disaster recovery test, it's important to test the plan annually as well. I'd like to note that cyber incidents require a different type of response. Traditionally, notifying local law enforcement may have been sufficient in certain events. However, during a cyber incident, it may be necessary to work with your industry peers, even your competition, and federal law enforcement. So I've just spoken about the importance of testing in the environment. I'd like to take a few minutes, and I guess we could talk about a test that some organizations don't do, but I'll leave that. And I'd like to move on to how to communicate specific risks from the C-suite to the boots on the ground in your organization. One of the major areas that JANUS works in, we call it translation services. We know that the SAN is down, the PCI audit is coming, the VMware ESXi system is locking up, there's too much amperage. These are all things that people at the C-suite aren't going to understand. They aren't going to be able to necessarily convert that into risk. Likewise, business goals that are generated at the C-suite don't always make it down to the boots on the ground for the same reason, because sometimes we're speaking different languages. So here's a brief plan on sort of to help you understand which questions you can ask, but also how to sort of map the various risks between different areas of your business. The first one is an asset assessment. When we think of assets, especially in finance, in accounting, we often think in terms of computers and desks and chairs and light bulbs and maybe a building. When we're talking about cyber war, we have to look not just at those physical assets, but also procedural assets. How does the data move from one place to another? How are the electronic file transfers done? How are the electronic payments done? But also as an asset, who is responsible for them? Who's their backup? Is there some person who's so critical to the organization that losing that person would be a major risk to our business? Secondly is a vulnerability assessment. Where are we vulnerable? Now, in the IT world, a vulnerability assessment could be a weakness, could be a lack of a patched machine. But in terms of the C-suite, when we're talking to the C-suite, they're going to think in terms of business process. They're going to think of a gap analysis, possibly a future state assessment, a plan. How are we going to get from where we are to where we need to be, and how much is it going to cost? The third area is a threat assessment. Most of who we see, really, they don't do a lot of threat assessments. But what we've just walked through here on this webinar today is really very much a threat assessment. Who is out to get me? Is it cyber criminals? Is it cyber warriors? Is it cyber criminals from within the United States, outside the United States? Is my local community protesting something that my bank is doing, and as a result there's a threat from just a local group within my community? These are all threats. Understanding who's going to perpetrate the attack and why is just as important as understanding where the vulnerabilities are. And finally, we take these three areas that we've just talked about and we roll it up into a business risk assessment. And that business risk assessment says, here's what we have as far as an inventory. Here's our gaps and weaknesses in our processes, in our procedures, in our plans, and here's who's probably going to come up to try and get us. When we put all those together, we get a business risk assessment, and that allows us to communicate from the top to the bottom and back up again using one document. So if you're in the C-suite, here are some questions you can ask. Or if you're boots on the ground, here are some questions you can ask to hopefully speak the same language. What is the mission of the business? Now, the mission of the business, honestly, we know there's two missions of the business. There's the one that's etched in granite on the front door, provide better quality, lower cost, help the community. And then there's the mission of the business that they talk about after the board meetings, talking about stock prices and investor relationships and so forth. When you speak that language, you have to understand which mission you're talking about. And of course, what threatens the mission of the business? In a lot of cases, competition can be the biggest threat to our business. We like to talk about cyber warriors. We're talking about all these nefarious activities, but understanding the threats, if another organization just like ours who's competing with us comes out with a newer product, that may steal business away from us. And then we can ask, how will these sort of threats be detected? Someone with their boots on the ground would say, oh, I have an IDS system, I have a firewall, I have a SIM tool. People in the C-suite may not know what any of these things are. They might glaze over. So to say that we have a technology that detects certain types of attacks, and that technology is monitored 24/7 by our contractor is a far better solution, far better explanation. We also have to ask what vulnerabilities exist that can be closed to reduce our risk. In some cases, we can come up with a plan to patch our systems more often, to replace a certain technology, to update a new technology. Just by getting rid of, I don't know, Real Player on all the desktops, you may lower your general overall risk, and that may be very useful. Of course, getting rid of Real Player may cause a business outage if people rely on it, but understanding how that's going to affect everything makes sense. And then finally, what will the cost of the loss of each asset be to the business? If we lose a certain server, what will that cost us? If we lose a certain person, if we lose a certain process, if an entire application goes away, can we continue to do it without computers? Sometimes we're never going to get rid of risk, but in some cases we can come up with a cost benefit. In some cases, it's so costly to get rid of a certain application that it's better to simply put compensating controls around it and to understand those types of controls. So as I'm winding down here, I don't know how much time we have left.
We have another minute.
Okay. We said this before, 55% of people would change their banks if their personal data was compromised. So what's the real value of that data? Is it the amount of cost that if it was lost, like credit card information, we know what it costs to recover from one credit card being stolen. But if you lose an entire client and they take all of their business away, is that really calculated in? How about the cost to our reputation, to our brand? In the lower right-hand corner, you see the target stock price. And at the very end there, you see a major dip. Well, that's the day they announced the major data loss. We can see why that happened, because everyone knew that it was going to cost billions of dollars to recover from this event, and that's going to affect stock prices. They may not be able to recover from this. They may be, but when you think of cyber events, you may think Target now until the next one happens. I guess that's about it.
Matt, we do have another minute or two here, and we do have a couple of questions. So real quickly, so that we don't take up too much of everybody's valuable time, one of the questions here talks in terms of how can you weed out network traffic pertaining to cyber warfare versus legitimate traffic in our monitoring system?
That is a question that has been asked for years. How granular do you want to collect logs? If it's legitimate traffic going to a file server and it's just regular NetBIOS traffic, can you ignore it? You can. It's almost impossible to do it correctly at 100%, especially today where the malware is using HTTPS, it's using an approved certificate, it's using a signed certificate, data is encrypted. It's very, very difficult to understand legitimate traffic, block legitimate traffic. It's easier in terms of cyber crime because you see a lot of data going out. Like I believe in the Target attack, there was something like 11 gigabytes of data that was leaking out of their environment. That would have been easier to detect than a cyber war event where no data was being stolen.
Okay, terrific. Time for one more question, and let's take this one. Is there one thing that will reduce our risk?
Training and awareness is still probably the best bang for the buck. There's been a lot of discussion of the EuroPay, MasterCard, Visa cards, Visa EMV cards, possibly reducing risk. Again, it will reduce it. It won't eliminate it. I still think that the insider threat is still one of the major issues. So sort of watching our inside guys, we see this with the Edward Snowden leaks. We see this with the issue in South Korea. That's the tough one to really check. As Lyle mentioned before, Target was breached. It wasn't by an untrusted entity. It turns out that they piggybacked onto a legitimate contractor. So
right, and so from that standpoint, one of the things that everybody on the call needs to keep an eye on is their third-party vendors, and if they're software or hardware people, copier people, what are they connected to the network, what are their access rights, and it's your system, you can control them, you can say to them, no, you can't have remote access to the system, which in this day and age probably isn't too bad an idea. Matt, we've run out of time. I want to thank you for your comments and your insights.
I do want to mention that JANUS does have a third-party vendor assessment program in place for those who are interested.
Shameless plug.
Sorry, I had to.
I hope that going forward, those of you on the call will consider using JANUS as a partner for your IT security and privacy-related services. Today's presentation will be available online for rebroadcast, and we'll notify you when it becomes available. On behalf of Matt Lane and everyone at JANUS Associates, I'd like to thank all of you for your time today. This concludes